My name is Mark, 54 years old, electrician from Ohio, the kind of man who keeps his head down and his hands busy. Calluses instead of comfort, silence instead of complaint. I've spent my life wiring other people's homes, making their light fixtures hum, their outlets breathe. Somewhere along the line, I forgot to keep the power running in my own life. I've been married to Susan for 10 years. 10 years of steady labor disguised as love. She had 2 children when I met her, Caleb and Hannah, both carrying the shadow of a father who had long since vanished. He left early when the kids were still learning how to spell his name. Moved to another state, sent a few cards, and then even the cards stopped. When Susan and I married, I thought I was stepping into a family that needed repair, not resurrection. I thought my patience could be mortar, my effort could build something sturdy. I was wrong. I took on everything: mortgage, utilities, tuition, health insurance, cars, groceries. Every number that came in the mail had my name next to it. I told myself that's what love was supposed to look like, the quiet assumption of responsibility. I covered gaps so no one else had to notice them. First, Susan thanked me. Softly, privately. She said things like, "I don't know how I'd manage without you." I used to believe her. But over time, her gratitude faded the way wallpaper fades in sunlight. Still there if you looked close enough, but dull, barely visible. After the 5th year, she stopped working altogether. She said the house needed her more. The children needed her more. But what the house really needed was maintenance, and what the children needed was direction. Both of which I provided, though no one seemed to see it. It's a strange thing to feel yourself dissolve inside the very life you built. You pay the bills, repair the roof, drive the errands, make the small talk, and still you start to disappear. Not all at once. Slowly, like breath fading on a mirror. I became the background hum of their comfort. Reliable, dull, and necessary. The man who didn't need appreciation because he was already supposed to provide it. The first time I noticed it clearly was the night of Hannah's graduation. Everyone gathered in the backyard. Family, neighbors, a few of her friends. There were speeches and laughter, photos by the maple tree. Susan raised a toast and said, "We did it, sweetheart." Everyone clapped. I stood beside her, smiling, waiting for the sentence to finish. It never did. That was the beginning of the quiet subtraction, the slow erasure of me from the word we. But the breaking point, the one that split the foundation completely, came one November. Caleb's birthday. He'd turned 20. We threw a party at the house. Balloons, cheap beer, loud music, a clutter of laughter that didn't belong to me. I grilled outside in the cold, smoke burning my eyes, pretending I was part of it. I wasn't. I was the hired help who didn't charge. When I came inside, they were gathered around the table. Caleb's friends, Hannah, and Susan. The cake was half eaten. Someone asked who had paid for the trip Caleb was planning. A ski weekend he'd booked without mentioning it to me. Caleb grinned. "The house does," he said. "My mom's husband or whatever." Laughter followed. That kind of laughter that isn't cruel because cruelty would require thought. It was worse, it was careless. The kind that makes you realize you were never considered in the first place. Hannah snorted, elbowing him, and Susan gave her usual defense. A small, nervous chuckle. The kind that says, "Don't make a scene. Don't make a scene." That phrase has been the silent rule of my life. Don't embarrass them with your feelings. Don't remind them who pays. Don't correct the story when it's convenient for them to forget. I washed the dishes after the party, alone in the kitchen, the echo of their laughter still hanging in the air. The sink filled with cold water, foam breaking under the weight of plates. I looked out the window at the backyard I'd landscaped myself, the lights I'd strung, the fence I'd built. Every board, every nail, every hour of overtime I'd traded for it. And I realized something simple, something heavy. You can give everything and still not belong. Susan came in later, her heels clicking softly on the tile. "They didn't mean anything by it," she said. "No apology. Just management. Damage control." I nodded. "I know." And I did know. That's what made it worse. In that moment, it wasn't anger I felt. Anger would have been too alive. What I felt was weariness and exhaustion older than my body. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes even breathing feel like labor. That night, lying beside her, I listened to her breathing, slow, even, detached. The rhythm of someone who has never carried another person's burden. I thought about all the times I told myself this was just a phase, that families take time to blend, that patience would buy me a seat at their table. But patience doesn't buy anything. It only delays the moment you realize no one was ever going to pay you back. I started counting things then. Not money, though there was plenty of that to count, but moments. Times I'd been dismissed, ignored, laughed at, overwritten. The jokes about my habits, the sighs when I offered advice, the empty chairs at dinners I paid for. I remembered when Caleb first got his car. I'd bought it used, fixed the engine, replaced the tires. The day I handed him the keys, he said, "Cool, thanks," and ran inside to call his friends. Later that night, I overheard him tell someone on the phone, "Yeah, my mom's helping me out." I said nothing then. I say nothing now. There's a quiet humiliation in being the man who holds everything together while being treated as if he could vanish and the house would still stand. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around, something inside me had hardened. Not bitterness that still required care, just resignation. When Caleb's friends came over again that weekend, I stayed in the garage. The laughter from inside sounded different now. Hollow, tinny, like a recording of happiness played through cheap speakers. I sat at my workbench, polishing a set of old tools I'd inherited from my father. The metal caught the light. My reflection wavered in it. Tired eyes, gray stubble, the faint tremor of a man trying not to shake. It hit me then. I'd become a ghost that still pays taxes. I thought of leaving, packed the idea in my head, like a suitcase I wasn't ready to close. But I didn't leave that night, or the next, or the next, because men like me don't leave. We endure. We tell ourselves that endurance is virtue, when really it's just fear wearing decency's mask. Still, I began to withdraw in small ways, gestures only I noticed. I stopped refilling the pantry before anyone asked. I stopped volunteering to fix what broke. When Susan mentioned a new vacation, I said, "Maybe next year." She didn't push. Maybe she didn't care enough to. The silence between us grew denser, like dust in a sealed room. Every conversation became a negotiation. Every kindness a transaction. One night, as I sat alone at the table, the hum of the refrigerator louder than usual, I realized something that felt like a confession. They didn't betray me. They just followed the example I set. A man who gave without question, who allowed himself to be replaced by convenience. I made it easy for them to forget me. That thought was the heaviest of all. When I went to bed that night, Susan was already asleep. I looked at her profile in the dim light. Familiar, distant, like a photograph from another decade. I felt no hatred, no love, just a dull ache of acceptance. I whispered into the dark, "You win." She didn't stir. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. Inside, I listened to it and thought, maybe this is what the end of devotion sounds like, not shouting, not anger, just the quiet creak of a house beginning to empty itself of meaning. And in that sound, for the first time in years, I heard myself think clearly. It was a single, unshakable thought, and it stayed with me until morning. They never saw me, and maybe they never were supposed to. After that November night, the world inside our house kept its shape, but the temperature changed. The same routines continued, the same dinners, the same bills stacked neatly on the counter, but something invisible had frozen between us. Words turned thin. Laughter sounded like static. I didn't explode. Men like me never do. We corrode. Slowly, quietly. Weeks passed before I acted. My decision wasn't born in anger. It came from exhaustion. A still, calculated kind of weariness that makes you dangerous because you finally stop pleading to be seen. The first shift came when Hannah called. She'd moved out 2 years earlier, renting a small apartment with friends near her university. Her voice on the phone was tight, careful. She said her paycheck hadn't cleared, her rent was late, and her landlord was threatening fees. Normally, I would have covered it before she finished the sentence. That's who I had been. The safety net everyone swore they didn't need but always fell into. This time I listened, nodded, and said, "You'll figure it out." The silence that followed was longer than the call itself. Later that night, I sat at my desk, opened a blank spreadsheet, and began typing. Line by line, I listed every expense I'd carried during the last 12 months: mortgage, utilities, groceries, tuition, car insurance, vacations, repairs, gifts. Numbers don't lie the way people do. By the time I finished, the total was more than $90,000. $90,000. A small fortune for a man whose only luxury was an old truck and a worn recliner. I stared at that number until it blurred. It wasn't pride that I felt. It was shock, the kind that comes when you realize you've been bleeding for years without noticing the wound. That spreadsheet was my confession, my proof of existence. The unacknowledged story of a man mistaken for infrastructure. The next morning, Susan came into the kitchen, robe pulled tight, coffee steaming in her hand. She asked if I'd seen the credit card bill. I said yes. She said Caleb had ordered parts for his car. He needed transportation for work. I told her he'd figure it out. Her eyes flicked up, confused. "He doesn't have savings, Mark." I nodded. "Maybe it's time he learns." She stared at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. In a way, I had. Responsibility was a dialect no one in that house had learned except me. That day, I made another decision. I went to the bank and opened a separate account, mine alone. I transferred my direct deposits, changed the online passwords, and left only the legal minimum in the joint fund. Half the mortgage, half the insurance. The rest of the household costs, the gas, groceries, streaming services, phone bills, would no longer feed off me. When I got home, Susan was at the dining table paying bills. She didn't look up. "I moved my accounts," I said. Her pen froze. "Why?" "Because I'm done carrying what no one notices." She set the pen down slowly, as if any sudden motion might make the moment worse. "You're overreacting." Maybe I was. But overreaction is just the name people give to proportion when they've grown used to imbalance. For the first time in years, I felt something close to relief. 2 days later, the questions began. Hannah called again, this time crying. Her card had been declined at the grocery store. Caleb texted about his car payment. Susan asked why the electric bill hadn't been auto-paid. I told each of them the same thing. Handle it. It was astonishing how quickly the air changed when the current stopped flowing. A house that had run smoothly on my invisible labor now sputtered like an engine out of fuel. Caleb stopped driving to work for a week. Hannah borrowed money from friends. Susan used the last of her credit limit to cover groceries. Their independence, once so proudly declared, cost more than they'd imagined. Meanwhile, I rented a small trailer near Lake Erie. Nothing special, thin walls, the smell of old pine, a narrow bed. But it was mine. My name on the lease, my light switch, my silence. When I told Susan, she looked at me as though I'd confessed to betrayal. "You're leaving." "I'm stepping back," I said. "I'll keep paying what the law requires. Nothing more." She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "So that's it? You're punishing us?" "No," I said. "I'm just removing myself from a system that forgot it runs on me." That night I packed a few clothes, my toolbox, and the photograph of us from the first summer we'd spent together. Back when her smile reached her eyes. I left it face down on the kitchen counter, not out of spite but because I didn't recognize the people in it anymore. The trailer was cold when I moved in. The heater rattled, the pipes groaned, but the quiet felt honest. I cooked canned soup, sat on the steps with coffee, and listened to the lake's slow breathing. For the first time in a decade, no one called my name from another room. At work, the men noticed. They asked if everything was all right at home. I said yes. They nodded, because men understand that yes sometimes means no, but it's none of your business. Weeks passed. The distance between us widened, filled with unanswered texts and awkward phone calls. Susan's tone softened, then sharpened, then softened again. She wanted to know when I was coming back. I told her I hadn't decided. Meanwhile, the small domestic crises multiplied. Caleb's insurance lapsed, and when he had a minor accident with his scooter, the hospital bills arrived in his name. Hannah's landlord threatened eviction. Susan's credit score dipped as she juggled balances. Each time the phone rang, I listened to the voicemail instead of answering. Their voices were different now, thinner, cracked, carrying the tremor of people meeting consequence for the first time. I didn't feel joy, just confirmation. Independence costs more than pride. By mid-December, the silence had turned brittle. Susan called one evening, her voice smaller than I remembered. "The heat's been off for 2 days," she said. "I'm trying to sort it out." "You'll manage," I said. There was a pause long enough to feel like a plea. Then she whispered, "You really don't care, do you?" I closed my eyes. I cared for 10 years. Now I'm resting. After that, the calls became less frequent. The house began to learn what absence weighs. When Christmas came, I spent it alone. The trailer smelled of pine from a small branch I'd brought in, more ritual than decoration. Outside, the lake was half frozen, the wind carrying the sound of distant bells from a town that wasn't mine anymore. Around midnight, headlights swept across the gravel. Susan stepped out of her car, wrapped in a coat too thin for the cold. She looked older than she had a month ago. "Can we talk?" she asked. We sat inside, steam rising from our mugs. She spoke first. "They're struggling, Mark. Hannah's scared. Caleb's angry. They don't understand why you do this." "Because they needed to," I said. "Because I needed to." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "You could come home. We could fix this." "There's nothing to fix," I said. "Only things to learn." She looked around the trailer. The bare walls, the unmade bed, the quiet. "You really prefer this?" I nodded. "It's honest. The house wasn't." When she left, she touched my shoulder briefly, a gesture halfway between affection and farewell. The door shut behind her with a sound that felt final. After she drove away, I stood outside, breath fogging in the cold air. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, rough and endless. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for their apology. I was waiting for nothing, and that nothing felt pure. By January, I'd grown used to solitude. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt earned. I worked, slept, cooked simple meals, kept count of the days by the steady hum of my own heartbeat. Some nights I thought of the house, of Susan and the children navigating bills, deadlines, and disappointments. I imagined Caleb learning to budget, Hannah working late shifts, Susan facing the mirror and seeing not a victim but an adult. Maybe they hated me for it. Maybe they finally understood me. Either way, it didn't matter, because for the first time in 10 years, every dollar I spent belonged to me. Every hour of labor fed my own life. And that, I realized, was the quietest kind of revenge. One that didn't need witnesses. It took less than a month for the silence I'd left behind to start echoing. I didn't need to ask how they were doing. The evidence arrived through the small fractures that carry truth better than words. Missed payments, late-night messages, the tone of desperation disguised as apology. At first, I ignored them. That wasn't cruelty, it was discipline. After a decade of being everyone's cushion, I wanted them to feel the floor. By mid-January, the cracks had widened. Hannah's friend called me by mistake, asking if I could help her move. "She's been crying a lot," she said softly. "Things are rough." I thanked her for calling and said nothing more. I hung up and stared at the phone until the screen went dark. A week later, Caleb called. His voice carried that same mixture of pride and panic that only comes when a young man's confidence meets consequence. "The insurance lapsed," he said. "It was an accident, nothing serious. I just need help covering the bills until next month." I told him to send me the documents so I could forward them to his real father. Silence. Then he muttered something I couldn't make out and hung up. Susan called later that night. "He could have been hurt," she said. "You think this is the time to prove a point?" "It's exactly the time," I said. "Because until the pain is real, the lesson isn't." She sighed the way she always did when she ran out of reasons that didn't sound like excuses. "You've changed." "No," I said. "I've stopped pretending." The following week, A letter from the utility company arrived at my trailer by mistake. Old address still on record. Final notice. Past due. I held it in my hand for a long time, the paper trembling slightly from the draft seeping through the window. That was the moment I realized my absence wasn't theoretical anymore. It was practical. It had weight. They had wanted independence. Now they could measure its price in overdue balances and cold nights. In February, I saw Susan again. She showed up at the trailer without warning, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. She didn't look like the woman I'd married. There was no polish, no deflection, only fatigue. "We can't keep up," she admitted. "The cards are maxed out. Caleb's working 2 jobs and Hannah." She stopped answering my calls. I said nothing. She leaned forward, her voice breaking. "You're proving your point. Congratulations. But you're destroying us in the process." I looked at her. "You say that like destruction is a new condition." She flinched. I poured her coffee, the silence stretching between us like a wire pulled too tight. "Susan," I said quietly, "you built a life on the belief that I'd always fill the gaps. You taught them that. You showed them that I was infinite. But I'm not. I'm just tired." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Maybe she'd run out of tears. When she left, I felt no satisfaction, only a strange kind of gravity, the pull of something ending without ceremony. Days passed. The air grew colder. The lake froze in jagged plates that cracked under the morning sun. I went to work, fixed what was broken in other people's homes, returned to a place that barely held heat. The trailer smelled of metal and old coffee. But it was mine. By late February, Hannah reached out. A short message. "I get it now." That was all it said. No excuses, no questions. I stared at it for a long time before typing a single reply. Good. For a brief moment, I felt something close to peace, until I saw Susan's number flashing on my phone again. I didn't answer. The next day she showed up in person, knocking on the door with that familiar rhythm I used to love. She stood there, pale against the wind, clutching her gloves. "Caleb's hurt," she said. My stomach tightened. "How bad?" "Broken wrist. The scooter accident. He's home now, but the bills, Mark, they're drowning us." I let her talk, let her spill every detail. The deductible, the unpaid premiums, the calls from collections. I listened, not as a husband but as a witness to the life I once funded. "Do you want me to fix it?" I asked when she finished. Her lips parted, confused by the question. "What? Do you want me to fix it? Or do you want to keep pretending I'm the problem?" Her silence answered for her. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "But sometimes mercy just resets the clock on suffering." She turned away, shaking her head. "You sound like a stranger." Maybe I finally became one. That night, I sat outside the trailer with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the lake groaning under its own ice. Somewhere across the water, another house flickered with light. Theirs, maybe. I imagined them sitting together, talking about bills, about me, about the way everything had slipped through their fingers. I didn't feel vengeance, only distance. When March arrived, the thaw began. Slowly, cautiously, the ice cracked open, and the sound was like thunder stretched thin. That same week, I got a letter, handwritten, careful, the kind of letter people send when they can't say something out loud. It was from Hannah. She wrote, "You were right. I didn't understand what you carried. I thought it was easy for you because you never complained. I used to think you worked so much because you liked it. Now I see it was because you didn't have a choice. I'm sorry I laughed when Caleb joked about you that night. I should have said something. I'm not asking you to come back. I just want you to know I see you now." I folded the letter and placed it in my wallet. Not forgiveness, but recognition. Sometimes that's all a man can hope for. Caleb called a few days later. He didn't apologize directly, pride still clinging to him like old dust. But he asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. He said he'd picked up extra hours, that he'd finally learned to cook something other than microwave meals. "You doing okay with the bills?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, then hesitated. "It's harder than I thought." I almost laughed. It always was. When the call ended, I sat staring at the phone. Not triumph. Not joy. Just quiet validation, the kind that doesn't make you feel bigger, only seen. By April, Susan stopped calling as often. I knew what that meant. Acceptance. The final stage of dependence is silence. But silence, when earned, is a mercy. Sometimes, on weekends, I'd drive past the old house. The shutters had started peeling, the lawn unkempt. I saw Caleb's car in the driveway, one headlight taped, the front fender dented. Through the window, I caught glimpses of them moving inside, their silhouettes blurred by distance. I didn't stop. I never did. I just watched long enough to remind myself that letting go doesn't mean abandonment. It means refusing to drown where others insist on sinking. That spring, Susan visited one last time. She didn't knock. She stood in the doorway of the trailer, hands clasped in front of her, eyes softer than before. "We're managing," she said quietly. "The kids are figuring things out." "That's good," I said. She nodded. "You were right, you know. We depended on you too much. I just wish you hadn't had to leave for us to see it. Maybe there was no other way." She smiled faintly, a sad kind of acceptance. "You look better. I feel lighter." She looked around the small room, the simplicity of it, the clean table, the tools stacked neatly by the wall. "So this is where you live now?" "For now," I said. "It's enough." When she left, I watched her car disappear down the narrow road until the dust settled and the lake reclaimed its quiet. I realized then that distance doesn't always create loneliness. Sometimes it creates clarity. They were learning to live without me, and I was learning to live without needing to be needed. By the time spring fully arrived, I'd stopped checking my phone for missed calls. The lake thawed completely. The air smelled of earth instead of frost. The family I'd built on endurance was learning, finally, what endurance costs. And I, for the first time in a decade, was learning what peace feels like when it isn't earned through sacrifice but through separation. Spring came like an apology no one voiced. The ice loosened its bite on the lake. The air smelled of thawed earth and wet rope, and the gulls returned to their arguments above the docks. I kept my life small. Work, coffee, walks along the breakwall. The evening ritual of checking outlets in a room that barely needed power. The trailer taught me a new arithmetic: one man, one bill, one key. The calls slowed, then stuttered, then nearly stopped. A different kind of quiet settled in. Not the bitter quiet of a slammed door, but the neutral hush of a room that finally fits the furniture. I didn't miss them, and I didn't celebrate their absence. I observed it the way an electrician tests a circuit, careful, exact, waiting for the flicker that means start again. In April, a letter arrived addressed in Hannah's patient, tentative handwriting. No accusation, no demand. Just a page with ink blotted where a sentence had started and been reconsidered. "I'm working 2 nights and a weekend shift. It's not glamorous, but it's mine. I paid the gas bill by myself." I didn't know paying could feel like breathing. I folded the letter and slid it behind the plastic of my wallet, next to the license that proves who I am to strangers. Proof does not make you seen, but sometimes it steadies your hands. Caleb reached me through a single text. "Need to talk. Not please. Not sorry." We met in a parking lot behind the kind of diner that survives every recession because it has no illusions. He appeared thinner, with the haggard light of someone who has learned that money is not a story but a clock. He stood without swagger, like a man who had discovered gravity by lifting the wrong box. "Insurance is sordid," he said. "I'm paying the hospital in installments. They're not kind, but they're clear." I nodded. Clarity is mercy wearing ugly clothes. He almost smiled, then didn't. "I thought you were punishing us." "I was stepping out of your shadow," I said. "Turns out it wasn't mine." We ate without appetite. Afterward, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin envelope. $40. He said it was a start toward what I'd covered that month years ago for a car he'd ruined and I'd repaired. I wanted to reject the gesture, call it symbolic, call it too late. But symbols are tools too. I took the envelope. He exhaled like a man who had been permitted to share the weight of his own name. Susan didn't write. She arrived. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray Ohio afternoon that keeps its promise to be nothing. She stood at the door of the trailer with cautious hands and eyes that had learned how to count. When I opened the door, the first thing she did was look past me, into the smallness. It made her blunt. "You're really living like this," she said, not unkindly. "I'm really living," I answered. She stepped inside and didn't remove her coat. "I got a job at the clinic. Intake desk. It isn't much, but it's something. Something is where balance starts," I said. Her mouth trembled the way a line trembles before it becomes a crack. "I keep thinking about that birthday," she said. "How I laughed when Caleb said what he said. I tell myself I didn't want to embarrass him. But that's not true. I didn't want to embarrass myself. I didn't want anyone to see the arrangement I built on you." The trailer held her voice like a confession booth holds air. "I turned the kettle on because it's what decent men do when the conversation decides to hurt. The water took longer than usual. Or maybe we were both done with quick. I carried it because I said I would," I told her. "But somewhere along the way we meant me." "I know," she said. "I know now." She showed me a notebook she'd brought, a ledger with columns and honest numbers. Half the mortgage, half the insurance, every small expense that used to vanish into a bottomless pocket named Mark. "I've been covering my half," she said, "and I've told them their halves are theirs." "How did that go?" "Poorly," she said, and almost laughed. "Then better. Then honest." We drank tea too hot to taste. Outside, the lake lifted itself against the rocks and fell back, rhythmic, uninterested in our math. She looked at my hands. The old cuts healed into pale threads. "You look lighter," she said again, as if she needed me to agree so she could grant herself permission to feel heavier. "I keep my receipts now," I said. "Not to collect from anyone. To remember I'm not infinite." She nodded. "I used to think a good man was a well with no bottom. That's how people drown." She stayed until the kettle cooled. Before she left, she touched my sleeve. Not a plea, a pause. "I'm not asking you to come home," she said. "I'm asking you not to hate the home we are without you." "Hate takes energy," I said. "I've given enough." When the door shut, I sat for a long time without moving, like a man waiting for a breaker to trip so he can confirm the fault was real. It had been real for years. May turned the lake a color that only exists for men who wake before the sun. A tired blue with a strip of nickel where the day intends to land. I worked. I saved. I returned to a room that made sense because it made no promises. On Sundays I drove past the old house. The lawn had lines now. Not straight but attempted. You can see effort from far away when you've been the only one making it. Hannah invited me for dinner in late May. "Just us," she wrote, then added, "Please." I went. The house smelled different. Onions and soap and a fearless amount of garlic. She had oversalted the potatoes, undercooked the beans, and made the kind of roast you can only cut by pretending not to notice the resistance. It was the best meal I'd had in years because every bite came with acknowledgement. She talked about school and work and how the manager keeps sending her home early when business slows. "It makes budgeting feel like aiming at fog," she said. "You'll learn to budget for fog," I said. "Everyone does." Halfway through the meal, she put down her fork and spoke the sentence that mattered. "I was cruel because it was easy. You were kind because it was required. That's not fairness. That's theft." I didn't comfort her. Comfort had been my currency, and I was done spending without return. I just nodded and said, "You're paying now." She slid a smaller envelope across the table than the one Caleb had handed me. A token payment for the months she'd lived like gravity was a myth. "It's not the amount," she said. "It's the shift." "I know," I said. "Shifts move houses." When I left, she hugged me in a way that asked for nothing. That's how I knew it was real. June offered an ordinary mercy. Time that wasn't demanded. I fished once, badly. I fixed a neighbor's porch light and refused payment, then accepted beer because men understand that refusing everything insults the giver. I kept the trailer clean by habit rather than compulsion. Clean is a statement. The man who lives here respects his own absence. Caleb visited again on a Friday. He had grease on his knuckles and quiet in his voice. They gave me more hours, he said. The manager said I show up even when I don't want to. He called it character. I call it bills. Same thing, different angle, I said. He asked if I would ever consider coming by on a Sunday for coffee. Not every week, he added quickly, as if sparing me the weight of routine. Just sometimes. Sometimes is honest, I said. Always is a lie people tell to make silence feel guilty. We sat on the trailer steps as the light softened into that forgiving hour where even mistakes look briefly intentional. He said, I used to think being a man was not needing anyone. He rubbed the grease deeper into his skin as if to keep it. Now I think it's paying for what you swear you want. I didn't say I wanted respect. He already knew. Susan called the first hot night of July. The air had turned heavy, the way it does just before storms decide whether to visit or spare you in order to hit harder later. We're planning a small dinner, she said carefully. No speeches. No staging. I thought if you wanted you could come. Leave when you need to. I arrived late on purpose. The table was set in reasonable plates. No glitter. No cheap celebration that pretends cost doesn't exist. Caleb had bought groceries. Hannah had cooked. Susan had cleaned. They didn't say these things like alibis. They let the house speak for them, room by room. We ate like people who had learned how to count before they praised. After the dishes were washed and returned to their old cupboards as if they had found a new way to live there, Susan stood at the sink and said to the window, I hope you know I don't expect you to fix anything anymore. I only hope you'll witness what we fix. I see, I said. Seeing costs me nothing now. In the hallway, the old family photo still hung. I had expected it to be gone, or replaced by one where my absence didn't tilt the frame. Instead, someone, Hannah by the neatness, had written a small date in pencil along the bottom edge. Not the day the photo was taken. The day I moved out. A ledger on paper disguised as a picture frame. I respected the honesty. It admitted that houses are built from events, not rooms. I didn't sleep there. I returned to the trailer because that bed knows what I owe it. Only what I can carry alone. Around midnight, a text arrived from an unknown number. Ken, the ghost father. I heard you're making them pay. For words, then silence. I didn't answer. Let the man wrestle with a mirror that finally reflects him. By August, the rhythm held. I paid my lawful half. They paid their halves, sometimes late, sometimes angry, but paid. We met for coffee on occasional Sundays. We did not confess our love. We acknowledged our ledger. Respect began to feel like flooring laid over old joists. Still creaking, but safe to cross if you understand where to step. On a late summer evening, Susan brought over a box. Not a plea, she said. A record. Inside were the old receipts I used to throw away because men like me were taught that proof makes generosity look petty. Date after date. Dollar after dollar. An archive of the invisible. I kept what I found, she said. So no one can say again that it was easy. Or that it was nothing. We sat with the box between us like a small grave you visit without knowing what to say. I didn't forgive. She didn't ask. We let the papers breathe their dry, expensive air. The lake cooled early that year. September's wind arrived like a reminder. I bought a thicker coat. Caleb replaced the worn tires on his own. Hannah changed the password on the streaming service to something she pays for and thus cherishes. Susan began bringing home stories from the clinic, stories with names removed and dignity left in. She had learned how to show up for strangers. It looked good on her. Better than ease ever did. Sometimes I ached for the simplicity of being needed. Then I remembered the price of that feeling and let the ache pass like a train I no longer had to catch. We are not reconciled. We're recalibrated. A quieter word. Less romantic. More accurate. It's enough to keep a table level. It's enough to let a man sleep. On the last warm night before the cold practiced its grip, I stood on the breakwall and watched the light drain out of the lake one silver line at a time. The air had that clean, metallic taste that makes memory seem like weather, present, moving through, not personal. 10 years I gave. A year I took back. Now comes whatever comes. Tell me something, and tell me honestly, When a man has been turned into a wallet with a pulse, and he finally closes, was he wrong to count the cost before he opened again?